so happy we alive.
Good evening, and welcome to Louisville Late Night. This evening, we're in the lovely Clifton Center in the Crescent Hill neighborhood. And this evening, we're here as a kind of relish of America, that the spirit of America is still alive, and that one thing we do in America is we look at things from many different views. And this evening we have a wonderful person, Amy Goodman, who has been leading the charge on getting a full perspective of what's happening in the world. She's a true leader and a wonderful person, and we can't wait to hear what she says. So get ready for Amy Goodman.
As well, but let's go back to that time. David and I have a chapter in the book called Hiroshima Cover-Up. We compare two reporters who covered the dropping of the bombs, an independent reporter named Wilfred Burchett and the New York Times reporter William Lawrence. After the dropping of the bombs, General MacArthur, the U.S. military, declared the whole area of southern Japan off limits. Sound familiar even today. And so most of the press went off the coast of Japan to a barge to cover the Japanese surrender. But Wilfred Burchett wanted to document, see with his own eyes the dawn of the nuclear age. And so he took a train for 30 hours and made his way to Hiroshima. He was devastated by the devastation. Never seen anything like it. Saw people with their skin melting off, saw the shadows of people ingrained in the sides of buildings. He saw people dying days, weeks after the initial explosion. Didn't have the words to describe what it was. Said they are suffering from some kind of atomic plague, a bomb sickness. And he sat down in the rubble with his Hermes typewriter and he tapped out the words, "I write this as a warning to the world." It was a report of words, but we are calling for times to be stripped of that Pulitzer. We have to break the embedding of the youth. And then I think of another example going back to World War II, and that is the story of Fred Korematsu. As we talk about the war abroad, we have to talk about the war right here at home. 1942, 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned. In Santa Fe, where I was recently, there's a marker for 4,555 Japanese Americans interned there. In Wyoming, in Utah, in Washington State, in California. It is such a shameful chapter in this country. You think about the thousands of mainly Arab American Muslim men who've been rounded up since 9/11. But Fred Korematsu, as we're in Los Angeles celebrating KPFK on March 31st, Fred Korematsu died. And the next day there was a obituary in the Los Angeles Times that also ran in the Seattle Times and talked about Fred Korematsu, a Japanese American who said no, he would not be rounded up. Eventually he was caught. They put him in a horse stall in a stadium in San Francisco. Then he was shipped off to Topaz, Utah, but he kept fighting. He fought the internment of his people, and he took his case right to the U.S. Supreme Court, where he lost every step of the way. Deeply ashamed, he didn't even tell his kids for decades about the lonely battle he had waged. And then in 1981, a legal historian named Peter Irons found these boxes of the documents of Fred Korematsu. Is that like him? And, yeah, at the computer. Can I have it? Is that mine? Yeah, can I have it? And You could just unplug it. Thanks. I wanted to read the piece from the Los Angeles Times. Thank you. Korematsu, it was said before the Supreme Court that Japanese Americans were interned because they represented an enemy race and they represented a threat, were engaged in treason. They were signaling shore-to-ship signals to Japanese warships. It later turned out that the government well knew what they believed was the signaling was kids going to outhouses with flashlights. And all of that was documented. Even J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI agreed. That's ultimately what they thought they were doing. But the general in charge of the area said they represented the enemy race, and even though the government knew that they were not engaged in treason, they lied to the Supreme Court, and that was the grounds that Peter Irons thought he could take this back to court in the 1980s. So he finds these boxes, he finds all the documents, he brings them to a U.S. District Judge named Marilyn Hall Patel. When the government realized what was happening in 1981, 82, 83, they wanted to offer Korematsu a pardon. He would not accept it. He said he didn't want forgiveness for refusing to do something he believed was unlawful. And so this judge set a hearing for November 10th, 1983 in a large ceremonial courtroom, anticipating the many internees and their families who would want to witness the historic hearing. Toward the end of the hearing, in an unusual move, the judge invited Korematsu, then 64, to speak. The courtroom stilled as Korematsu spoke for several minutes. As long as my record stands in federal court, he said, any American citizen can be held in prison or concentration camps without a trial or a hearing. Everyone expected the judge to take the case under submission for a later ruling, as would be normal. But in another surprise, she ruled from the bench, saying she intended to both vacate the conviction and make formal findings of fact, everything Korematsu had asked for. She recalled later, I don't think there was a dry eye in the courtroom. Irons was sitting next to Korematsu. He said the audience was stunned. They just witnessed an unprecedented event, that this whole internment issue had been resolved by a court 40 years later in their favor. In 1983, a federal commission unanimously concluded the factors that shaped the internment decision were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership rather than military necessity. President Reagan in '88 declared the internment a grave injustice, signed legislation that gave $20,000 to surviving internees, including Korematsu. Each one got that. In 1999, President Clinton awarded Korematsu the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. And at the ceremony, Clinton said, in a long history of our country's constant search for justice, some names of ordinary citizens stand for millions of souls. Plessy, Brown, Parks, Clinton said. To that distinguished list today, we add the name of Fred Korematsu. And you would think at that point, Fred Korematsu, who could stand proud then before his children, could rest. But he didn't. In 2003, a frail and aged Fred Korematsu reemerged to fight again. This time on behalf of detainees being held without charge and without access to attorneys, notably over 600 prisoners on Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Korematsu filed a friend of the court brief in support of the detainees who were being held indefinitely and without charge at the whim of the U.S. government. He said of his experience defending civil liberties, in order for things like this to never happen, we have to protest. So don't be afraid to speak up, he said. He died 2 weeks ago. And here we have thousands who have been arrested, who have been detained. So many have been deported. We don't know their names. They don't